Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind, episode 83.
When we talk about private education being only for the rich, we're ignoring what's actually happening in over half the world. It is not only for the rich. It is only for the rich if we decide that it's only for the rich. And the reality is that even here in the United States, it is entirely possible for a single parent to privately educate their child, for a poor family to privately educate their child. There are lots of ways and systems and organizations put in place that a person can take advantage of to begin that process.
Benjamin Franklin once said, "Do not curse the darkness, rather light a candle instead." If you're ready to set your mind on fire, then prepare yourself for the Luminous Mind with your host, Rebecca Bowman.
Today's fire starter is Stephen Horwich. Welcome, Stephen Horwich, to our program. We've had him on before. He's episode 40, 60, and then you have a whole week in July that we have you. But we're actually going to talk about something I think is pretty positive, and that is setting up community schools and how teachers can go ahead and set up their own private schools. So welcome.
Yes, thank you again.
Yeah.
Goodness. I think I've moved in as far as your radio show is concerned. My bags are at the door.
I love having you on because you are a highly, these are topics that you've done a lot of writing on and that you've educated yourself on almost better than anyone. And in fact, when I was looking, I just am releasing another one of our podcasts, and so I was looking over your website, and I'm like, how did I miss these two books? Because you're so good. You don't even mention that you have books on these.
I don't, because, we're talking about specific things and trying to assist people as much as we can with information they can immediately use. But yeah, I've written 3 books about homeschooling and private education and how to do them, each book with a different purpose. And if you like, we can talk about that at the end. I'd be happy to do it, and maybe people can get the books and benefit from what's there. But we have so much ground to cover, I never get to those things. So.
That's why we keep having you on, because we can't get through it all. So
there you go.
One of the things that I kind of want to start off on, when we talk about private education, we're just, again, pooling money for education. How is that going to end up being different than what we have in public schools?
There are a lot of ways that private education can be different than public education. But I think, again, we should carefully define what we're talking about, because private education is a broad moniker. It covers a lot of different approaches to education, some of them institutional, some of them not. You look at a charter school, and a lot of parents think that charter schooling is private education, and it's not. Charter schools are an extension of whatever school district they happen to be in, and they're funded almost entirely, generally, by the local school district. So they're restricted as to what they can do to a very real extent by what the district allows them to do and by national standards, and they have to apply themselves to national standards like Common Core in educating their children. So that is not private education. Charter schooling is a hybrid, and it's an attempt by school districts, and not a terrible attempt, but a failed attempt, I think, by school districts to pull into their process the best of private education and still be a public school. It doesn't work because the same restrictions apply in charter schooling as apply in public schools, in the general term, public schools.
And I guess some of the reasons, and maybe you can either disagree or agree with me, that maybe public schools fail is that, first of all, it's a top-down sort of education, where you have a bureaucrat who's maybe not in the classroom making the decisions for what happens in the classroom. Mm-hmm. And then I would think the other problem is when you are gaining your funds through taxation, there's really no incentive there to increase the product. You just keep saying, oh, well, we just need more money. And
That's right. No, I'm going to agree with you because we always agree on it. Yes, I agree that those are tremendous flaws in the entire idea of public education, that there isn't any incentive for the school to do well. They've tried to change that, and we don't want to get too much into the negatives.
Yeah, we talked about testing and all of that.
Right. They've tried to change it with teacher incentives and that kind of thing, but it really isn't working very well. So let's stick to private education, you and I, and talk about what that means. It does not mean charter schools, but it does mean private schools that are started by independent parties, independent of school districts, not under the control of the school district they happen to sit in, not in any way beholden to national standards. Those would be private schools. I think I told you earlier a story about a friend of mine who opened a private school in Texas, and was a very successful, very fine teacher, and wanted to move out of California because the rules were becoming restrictive for private education.
Well, and their rules are probably more like wheelchair accessible type rules, like
all of that, all of the building restrictions that go with a school apply to private schools here in California where I live. There's a mountain of restrictions that a private school has to meet. So she moved to Texas, and she met with the head of the school district where she was going to place her private school. And the first question she asked the head of the school district there was, what restrictions or rules will my private school have to abide by? And the head of the district, bless her heart, said, what did you not understand about the word private? So, which I think is beautiful.
Yeah, too bad we didn't have that everywhere, huh?
Yeah, too bad we don't have that everywhere. Exactly right. A private school, it's a business owned by an individual or a corporation or whatever corporate structure they put on it, but it is not a part of a school district, and hence not taking money from the school district, not using tax money, and not beholden to their standards. So that's a very important principle to keep in mind when you're addressing private education. It should not be accepting public money in order to function. It can accept corporate money, and there are private schools all over the place that are funded by corporations. That happens. But it cannot accept public funding, and if it is, that always comes with strings attached, always. I knew some private schools that were going for federal funding
through grants
for individual programs. Yeah, exactly right. And I was writing grant proposals for a while for several schools over a couple of years. And what I found in the process of writing those grant proposals, some of which got funded, was that there were always strings attached with federal funding. And that school that accepted that funding for anything. I remember one private school that accepted funding to put a playground equipment up. They got federal funding for it. But the restrictions turn them into essentially an extension of the school district, and they should not have accepted the money. So it's very important when folks go out there looking for private education and they're making an effort to divorce their children from the system because the system has failed their children so badly, that the question they ask right off the bat is, does your private school accept public funding, federal or state funding? Or city funding. If it doesn't, then it's a private school. It does not need to abide by Common Core. It does not need to give the federal tests. Generally speaking, usually, depending on the school district, they're much freer to teach the way they wish. Now, the same thing, interestingly enough, applies to home education, homeschooling. So a homeschooler does not in any way need to adhere to Common Core and does not need to adhere to any federal standards. We do not have to provide tests to our children unless we want our kids to go to college, and then we have to do the same tests that everybody has to do in order to be accepted to a college. But the funding comes from within the family, except that there are now some states that are changing their laws. Just this week, just a few days ago, Nevada changed its laws about education and funding. And here's what they did. They decided that any parent should have the right to remove their children from a school district and privately educate them. And they decided to back up that right by allowing that parent to take $5,000 out of the tax fund and apply it directly to their kids' private education. This just happened this last week. I know it because my brother lives in Nevada, and he's about to start homeschooling his son. We've been talking about it, and I ran into this new law that just got passed. So what does that mean? It means that the schools do not receive that money for that student. Instead, that student's parents can spend that money to send them to a private school. So that money now leaves the system, goes into a privately owned company, which hopefully will be, competitive. This is what the Nevada state legislature is after, is competition. They want the schools to be forced to compete with private education, and in that way, demanded to provide a better result. It's a very interesting idea, and it's a very interesting application of a free market economy. Needless to say, the teacher unions are screaming, they're furious. It's split along political lines. The support of it is almost entirely on one side of the political fence. But I don't care about the politics of it. I'm not political when it comes to education. And in my view, both parties have destroyed public education, equally guilty, and have nothing to hold their heads up about. But in this case, it's a very interesting change in the law, and there are 4 other states that have done the same thing. I think Indiana is one of them, but I'm trying to remember which ones. In any case, this just happened in Nevada, and if I were a parent in Nevada of a kid and I wanted to privately educate my kid, I would know that most private schools' tuition is going to be about $1,000 a month, depending on the age of my kid in the school. It can go up to $3,000 a month. It can be as low as $600 a month. It just depends on the school and where it is. But on average, here in Los Angeles, most private schools are about $1,000, $1,200, $1,300 a month for a child. So if you look at that new law, basically what it pays for is 4 to 5 months of private education. Given that the school year ostensibly is 9 months long, it pays for roughly half of the tuition your child would need for a school year. So it's an interesting halfway measure. If you also consider that if you send your kid to the public school in Nevada, that school district spends about $15,000 for your child while he's there, though, of course, your child doesn't benefit from that expense. A lot of it goes into administrative costs and all kinds of nonsense. But they're going to spend $15,000 for the 9 months of education your child receives, and that $15,000 is paid for through tax money. The $5,000 you would secure from tax money to privately educate your child in Nevada is a third of what the public school is going to spend or be forced to spend, half as effectively. So there's an interesting change there.
We kind of talked about this before we started, but, a lot of people think that public schools, and they're there to educate everybody, so everyone gets kind of a universal education. That includes the rich, the poor, whoever. I mean, we're not talking about being heartless here and throwing, poor people out on the street where they don't have an education. I mean, how do we go about educating the poor with private education?
Yep, that's the big question, and there are a lot of really good answers to that question. First of all, you and I have discussed in the past a wonderful book called The Beautiful Tree by Tooley, right? Isn't it Tooley?
Yeah, James Tooley.
In which Mr. Tooley, what he did was he traveled through China and India looking for sort of legendary, very small private schools outside of the system entirely that were educating the poorest of the poor, people living on under $2 a day, under the poverty line.
And when he started, it was to basically prove that, all these private schools are really educating the rich, but he actually found out something very different.
That's exactly right. He was told and he believed that private education was entirely for the rich, and he went out to prove it. And what he discovered was exactly the opposite was true. Throughout China, throughout India, throughout the Middle East, he talks about in his books, there are thousands of very small private schools with around 100 students or less, funded by, 15 cents, 20 cents, $1 here and there from families that can't even afford that. They take the children in and educate them anyway, paid for by the $1 that the other family could afford. They do it for almost nothing, and the education they're providing is superior to the public school education in those countries, China and India in particular. And when we talk about China and India, we're talking about almost half the population of planet Earth. So this is not a little thing, and it is a huge test subject. There's enough numbers there for us to understand and know that this works. These schools are run by whoever happens to be around who feels like they can run a school. They're private enterprises. They're under the radar. They are not approved by the state. He talks about looking for them and not being able to find them until some kid on the street says, hey, are you looking for my private school? I'll show you where it is, and leading him down dark alleys into back lots and dark doorways until he walks into a school.
But he said that the schools, they're just as clean, they're just as well taken care of. The staff there, he says, is actually present and awake and excited about what they're learning.
Right, and more than that, the operative word that you just said is that the staff is present. He talks about how in public schools throughout China and India in particular, absenteeism on the part of teachers is rampant.
Or they're asleep.
Or they're asleep. So these kids in these small private schools coming from families below the poverty line, and I want your listeners to understand that when we say below the poverty line, we're not talking about poverty in the United States. Poverty in the United States is nothing like poverty in other places. We're talking about families living on under $2 a day. Under $2 a day. It is nothing. They have nothing to work with. Now, those economies are structured differently, and you could argue that $2 goes farther in India than it does in the United States, but it isn't entirely true. And if you have a wife and a husband and 3 children or 2 children, and you're trying to survive on $2 a day, essentially, and you also are sending your child to a private school, that's miraculous. And Thule found exactly that happening all over the place when he went looking hundreds and hundreds of private schools, owned and operated by locals, below the line, government not involved, getting better results in testing than the local schools. So when we talk about private education being only for the rich, we're ignoring what's actually happening in over half the world. It is not only for the rich. It is only for the rich if we decide that it's only for the rich and we structure our laws and our economics to prevent people from poorer families, from poorer situations economically, from benefiting from private education. And the reality is that even here in the United States, it is entirely possible for a single parent to privately educate their child, for a poor family to privately educate their child. There are lots of ways and systems and organizations put in place that a person can take advantage of to begin that process, which is what we're talking about today.
Well, and keeping the price high many times comes from the fact that we do have a public education system that is so expensive in itself that some of these private schools, if there were more and they felt more competitive, that they could lower those prices. We're actually making a situation where we're keeping the poor, and we're keeping them down because we're giving them public schools. But if it's a pathway to, in D.C., I think I've talked about this with some other guests that I've had, but the school is basically, if you go to that school, you'll end up in the prison that's down the street, because it's that. Yeah.
And again, not to run too negative with it, but the Washington School District, the head of that district, I don't know if she's still there, was Michelle Rhee, R-H-E-E. And she was held as a hero because she was the one who started out the idea of giving teachers incentives for their students to score better on tests. And almost immediately, the teachers in the Washington School District, as they did in Atlanta, as they did in Portland, as they have all over the United States, started to falsify their students' test scores so they could make more money.
Yeah. So, to speak positively of her, one of the things that got her mad and got her basically removed as a chancellor is that she did go in and fired like half the staff and saw she did see improvements that way. But yeah, she has pushed a lot on the testing and making that a qualifying thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the philosophy for that really, sadly enough, begins with her. And it's become an epidemic that we now see resulting in something like Common Core, where all of education in public schools is based around testing and test results. So let's go back to the positive
of what teachers can do. You talk to so many that feel stuck. Let's give them some options of what...
Yeah, I can give them an option right now. They should quit teaching for the school district and go into private education, open up small schools, charge enough from their students that they can survive and keep their business open. but no more than that, because education should not be a boondoggle. It should not be about making a fortune. It's fine for somebody to make a living. They should. If you're teaching, you should make a living, especially if you're doing it well and children are benefiting.
Well, and of
course you should make a living.
Well, I have 3 different friends, but one actually was a guest on here that actually has started somewhat of a private school in her home, and she's basically homeschooling a larger group of kids, but she does charge the parents, a fee, and in reality, it's really not that expensive. I think it's $150 a month per student.
Right. Well, that's what I did after I started homeschooling my children in 2002. Within a month, I'd shown the curriculum that I was writing to several friends of mine who were teachers. They got very excited about it. They wanted their kids pulled from the private school they were in. They wanted them homeschooling, and they wanted them using my curriculum. So we had an arrangement where these 2 trained, supervisors, trained teachers basically, would handle the kids while I wrote curriculum and acted as headmaster. They all came to my house every day. We did this for years, about 4 years. I had at least 10 kids in my house every day with these 2 teachers and me working with them while I developed my curriculum, and they did the curriculum, the kids. We had all these kids. I moved. I rearranged my house to make it work as a school. We had a room set up as a library and study room. We had another room. We had several TV monitors set up so they could watch videos that were a part of the curriculum, all kinds of things. And I think I charged the parents, I think I charged something like $50 a month so that the electrical, water, and power would be covered for the kids being there, and that was it. I did that for 4 years, so that evolved into opening a private school with one of the parents acting as the business end of it and the funding to really pilot the program. And we ran that private school for just over a year and really got a feel for how we could use this curriculum in a private situation. Now, I'm in an unusual situation because I'm a writer and that's how I make my living. And I wasn't looking to make money as an educator, so I wasn't charging families that were studying with me. When we opened the school, we had a tuition. We were a private school. And we charged something in the vicinity of, I think, around $1,000 a month. And that was in LA County, where that would be on the low end for private schools. But it evolved kind of organically out of starting to homeschool my kids, having other parents get excited about what I was doing, having them bring their kids, and then having the parents start to get involved. So within a month or 2, we had what I would call a homeschool group, where there were 3, then 4, then 5 families connected up to what we were doing. It proceeded like that for a number of years, and then it evolved into the next organic step, which was a small private school.
That's awesome. It can happen like that, too. If you start to homeschool, you do find, I guess we'll talk about that, too, of how to make those community schools so that you can benefit from each other, so there's not burnout, so they're able to have the interactions with other kids for mostly just some peer-to-peer type reviews.
Well, but again, if you are doing the homeschool group approach, as we did at my house, those 3 or 4 years where I had 10 kids in the house, there were plenty of my children. I have 2 kids, and the other 8 kids there every day were their friends or became their friends during that period of years. So every day they had that peer-to-peer relationship. And education, is a very personal thing. Kids don't learn in groups. They learn one by one. And each child learns one fact or skill at a time. And it's a very intimate, personal experience. Education has nothing to do with groups, nothing to do with institutions. As a homeschooler and in a homeschool group or in a very specialized school that has this philosophy, you can allow each student during their educational time to really focus on their own needs and moving at their own speed and learning what they want to learn or what they're interested in learning, and then balance it, because you have a homeschool group or a small school, balance that educational, private, intimate experience with a more social experience of having the kids, spend time together and do sports together or play games together or go on field trips together, eat lunch together. There's a lot of opportunity every day for the kids to get the social thing going.
Yeah. Do you kind of want to go through some of the different options that you can have? You can do some on your own at home and then join and have a once a week type
sure.
group, or there's so many options.
There are tons of them. I guess we could go step by step real quickly through some of this. The lowest common denominator for private education is the one family, one parent is teacher, kids model. I'm mom, I'm teaching my two kids, we're a homeschool group. And yeah, they are a homeschool group of a type. But I think that's the hardest model to operate on. I think it's very rough to ask kids to learn from mom or learn from dad, and only mom or dad, year after year after year. And it isn't a comment about mom and dad. They may be very well equipped to keep those children interested and keep their education moving, but without some kind of outside help in specialized areas or in curriculum or in PE or in whatever, which you and I discussed the last time we talked, getting your kids out for PE and getting your kids out for arts courses and stuff like that. I think it's very hard because your mom or your dad and your kids after a while will snap back and get snippy on you because you're endlessly teaching them. So it's a good idea to bring in at least one other family, and that moves it out of the one family model, which again I think is the roughest. If you have two families involved or three families involved, you do have a homeschool group. What you want to do then is create an agreement with the other families, especially with the parents, but also with the kids, about what is expected from everybody. And what should be expected is not just that they put in $150 a month, as you were describing, but each parent should be required to spend time every week with the kids, teaching in some area of expertise or assisting in some way that they feel comfortable doing. It should be required. You're not asking much from a parent to come in for 2 to 3 hours and work with the kids once a week. And again, with a private homeschool group, even a private school, your hours do not have to align with work hours as it does with public school. Kids are stuck in public school, so mom and dad can go to work.
Yeah, a lot of times it's a babysitting deal.
you bet. And with a private school or a homeschool group, you could start your educative work at 1 in the afternoon and finish at 7. So mom and dad, all of a sudden, everybody becomes available at 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock to work with those kids. And they could really benefit from having the advantage of the experience of 4, 5, 6 adults over that week in specialized areas. And all of that should be in writing, as well as whatever financial agreements you have with the other families and that kind of thing. Everything should be written out simply, clearly, and signed and dated. So everybody gets a copy of it and everybody knows what's expected. They can't come back later on and say, well, I didn't know you wanted me there on Wednesdays at 4 when they signed a document that said they want you there Wednesday at 4. So I think that's very important. I also think you need to get a signed agreement from every child old enough to understand what you're talking about, that they will earnestly, honestly attend, do the work, not play video games at night on school days, not eat sugar on school days, all the things that get in the way, will not watch a lot of TV on school nights, all the things that really get in the way of a kid being able to function, get enough sleep, none of this 4 hours of sleep and showing up at homeschool because it's homeschool and you don't have to perform. That's nonsense. The onus is on the child to perform in private education and homeschooling, and the child has to come through. And if they're exhausted and ill-fed, that's not going to happen, and the kid has to understand that and sign an agreement and come through.
Yeah. And it is a positive thing because most of the time when we get the kids involved, they're excited about it too. They just flourish because they're excited about it.
Yeah, and you know what? A kid who's not excited about it probably shouldn't be forced to do it. Now, I have encountered a number of kids who were not excited about the idea of homeschooling or even private schooling. Their friends were in their public school. They were being forced to leave their friends behind. They didn't want to. There was a lot of that kind of thing when I was doing a lot of private schooling and when I ran my private school. And what I always asked the kid to do was this. I would say, I'll tell you what, I understand that you want to be back there, not here. Give us 2 weeks, make it an earnest attempt on your part to understand what we're doing to educate you and how we're supporting you and what we're about. Spend 2 weeks here, and if you really don't like it, then I'm going to tell your parents you really don't like it and you really shouldn't be here. And invariably, the kids would, after, a little arm pulling, they would agree. And after 2 weeks, they were happy to stay. They didn't want to go because they were actually being attended to and cared about, and their interests and needs were being met, unlike in public education. So, you may have to negotiate a little bit with a child to get them to start. But truly, if their intention isn't there, if they're really not interested in doing what you're doing, you're going to have a very hard time with them. And I don't see any point in enforcing it any more than I would enforce public education on a child.
Well, and that's part of the problem with compulsory attendance is that you end up with kids that don't want to be there, and then they just make it miserable for the other kids that do want to. So don't try to force that. Before we go on, let us take a minute and hear about our sponsors. Ready to homeschool your children, but you have no idea where to start or how to do it? Already homeschooling, but you're running into problems, or maybe you just want to improve results. Are you an expert homeschooling parent looking for every possible angle for your children? The Homeschooler's Handbook, written by an award-winning teacher with over 40 years' experience at every level of education, has the tools and answers you're looking for. Use the link on the luminousmind.net podcast show notes page and buy your own copy of the Homeschooler's Handbook today. Welcome back to The Luminous Mind with Stephen Horwich on building community and private schools. Now, you do have, in some of your books and your resources, you have an outline of what a contract should look like, correct?
I have templates for contracts. I actually have contracts. And for all the different agreements necessary to start your homeschool group effectively. I have a book called The Homeschooler's Handbook. It basically comes in 3 parts. The first 2 parts explain exactly the best way to teach with a non-critical, student-centric approach. Exactly the opposite of what schools do, basically. I don't want to get into it right now, but it's a whole different approach to education that you, mom, or you, dad, or you, homeschool or private teacher, would employ to get far better results than what the critical public school approach takes. The last third of the book is just about how to start and run successfully a homeschool group. And of course, that can evolve into a school. So when you open a school, the moment you start using the word school or academy, a lot of states have laws that kick in the moment you call yourself that. So starting a homeschool group, you may not wish to call yourself a school or an academy. Now, there are some states that give you a tax break if you do call yourself a school or academy. So you're going to have to find out, depending on where you are, what the laws are. Is it to your advantage to call yourself a school or academy, or is it a disadvantage? And you're really going to want to know before you call yourself anything. If you call yourself a school or academy, you may have to register as a business and do the whole DBA thing, doing business as and fictitious name and whatever. I don't recommend it very strongly unless you want to open a school, a real school, and advertise and bring in outside children and hire teachers and do all of that kind of thing. But for a homeschool group, in most states, you don't need to do anything legally to start your group because it's not a business. Now, your friend, the one you were talking about, who's charging the kids to be there, even though she's not charging much, that's a business by definition because she's charging for her services. She's not asking for reimbursement for expenses, which is a whole different animal. She's charging for her services, and she's not charging very much, but she's charging, and that makes her a business and subject to all the laws and regulations of a business.
Yeah, and I know
she has kids in her house.
She's actually got a business license and everything, and she's done.
Right.
But it was less cumbersome here because the way her curriculum is laid out, it's more like a homeschooling type curriculum. Mm-hmm. So the state is leaving her alone. I mean, as far as what they're requiring from her. So
yeah, hallelujah for that, right?
Yeah.
Well, when we ran my school, when we were running the school, the whole point was to see how the curriculum that I constructed for homeschooling worked in a school environment. Now, to be fair, I had already seen how it worked because I had seen it used in 3 other private schools rather extensively and very successfully. So I knew it was going to work, and the question was how to make it work best. But it's unquestionably a homeschooling curriculum where each student moves their own pace through every lesson plan and subject. And that immediately removes it from the impetus of schools and what schools do. It removes it from that. So I understand what your friend is doing. And, I think what she's doing is very typical around the world, starting your own little school and having 10 students, 15 students, up to 100 students in India and China in the middle of nowhere. Those schools in China that he described, they were hundreds and hundreds of miles from big cities. In the middle of nowhere, there were schools. He was finding them under rocks and trees. It's quite miraculous what he describes in his book.
Well, and even that is a selling point for some of these parents because, like we said, they are the poor people of that area, and they didn't want to have to send their children off to long bus rides and all of that when the education right there was just as good or even better. So,
or better.
Yeah, better. You have a couple of books, too, written on basically how to start your own school, correct, or your own community?
Well, yes and no. Here's what I've got. I've got a book called Poor Cheated Little Johnny, and Poor Cheated Little Johnny explains exactly how public education has failed us and describes a little bit of what can be done to rectify it, but mostly describes the problem and starts to point at some solutions to the problem. That book does talk about starting homeschool groups, starting homeschooling, and also how to develop schools that might work. My second book is called Universal Private Education. I think that's the subtitle. I think the title is not alternative education, because that's what public educators love to call homeschooling and private school is alternative education. We're not the alternative. Public schooling is the alternative. It's new in the history of man. It's just 160 years old in the United States. But private education was the standard for thousands of years. And when you open up your history book and look at all the great people who founded our country, did the great writing, wrote the beautiful music, et cetera, almost all of them were privately educated. It's almost entirely so. So that's the standard. The alternative is public education. And in that second book, I talk about how we can dismantle public education and replace it with well-funded private education funded from many sources, including corporations and the rest of it, how we can turn public schools, these huge facilities, into community resources that everybody can use, especially private educators, because they have theaters and they have labs and they have big PE fields, and these are fantastic resources that our taxes pay for and we should all have access to. And then the third book I wrote is the most useful, and that's the Homeschooler's Handbook. And that one describes step by step by step how to start homeschooling, how to homeschool successfully, how to start a homeschool group, how to do that successfully, how to expand it. It really is a handbook for homeschoolers, providing lots and lots of tools and lots of step-by-step descriptions of what to do. I don't leave a lot to the imagination in that book.
And I know we've kind of touched on some of those, but I do have to applaud Stephen. He's never really tried to sell his stuff on my podcast, but I would definitely check those out as resources for doing any of these things. So do you want to kind of give us an idea of what your vision would look like if we went ahead and dismantled this system?
I'd be happy to. I do that in each of the 3 books, actually. But yeah, sure. Here's what I see. First of all, it's important to know that every year the United States is spending close to $600 billion on public education. $600 billion for roughly 70 million students and paying 3 million teachers. So that expense is one of the several expenses, governmental expenses, that is drowning the U.S. in debt, absolutely killing us. A lot of it goes to paying teacher pensions, which are enormous. In Chicago, the average teacher receives over the life of their retirement some $2 million in perks and in actual finance. So why a retired teacher would receive $2 million after retired is a complete and utter mystery to me. And it explains why Chicago is always in financial duress. But the teacher unions sure have done a good job of making sure teachers get paid. They haven't done a good job at anything else, but they make sure teachers get paid. What I see is that public education right now is in decline. People are pulling their kids because of Common Core and testing and the rest of it at a rate that is faster than it has ever been, and it's accelerating. As can be witnessed, for instance, in North Carolina, where now there are more homeschoolers than there are private schoolers, and it's the number of homeschoolers is rapidly approaching the number in public school in that state. So we're seeing the numbers shift very, very heavily towards private education and away from public education because it's cheaper, because it's more effective, because kids are safer. There are reasons.
Parents have more say in a way.
You bet. So and a kid can study what he's interested in instead of being forced to study some quote unquote standard, math, science curriculum. There's nothing wrong with math and science, but they're just two subjects and there are all kinds of interesting subjects out there. So I see the end of public education in the wind. I see it coming in the next 20 years. I see a shift financially towards private education. I think that government will attempt to continue to control education by funding private education and then issuing limits and restrictions as to how the money gets spent.
Well, and that's really, when you were talking about the government giving money to some of these private schools, and that's just kind of their way of putting their fingers in how those are even ran.
That's exactly right. So as private educators, if you're going to run a school or you're going to run a homeschool group, rule number one is you cannot take public funding. You can't do it. Now, I don't know how it's going to work in states like Nevada that is turning that $5,000 over to the family to privately educate their children and pulling it from public education. I don't know what restrictions that will come with. I have to read that law. But if there are restrictions attendant to it, and it's very likely there are because it's government and you're taking their money, you're taking food off of teachers' tables, oh my. So, there may be restrictions and rules that you have to abide by. But the bottom line is this: as more and more people make the move and understand that they can make the move, it's legal, you can afford it, there are lots of models whereby you can do it. Look at the homeschool group idea. So your mom and you work and your husband works, you both work. How are you ever going to privately educate your kid in a homeschool environment? The answer is have your family join up with other families, form a homeschool group, move the hours of that school later in the day so that some parents can be there in the afternoon, other parents can be there early in the evening. Make your work schedule, contribute to that flow. Most businesses will allow you, as long as you put in your 8 hours, to do kind of shifting if you need to, but you may not need to. And then everybody becomes available to participate in the homeschool process. And mom and dad become directly involved in their child's education, the very thing that schools and PTAs keep screaming they want, but they don't want homeschooling. Well, the only way mom and dad get involved directly in junior's education is through a homeschool process or in a very small private school where they're directly involved, because PTAs do not change the way education is done.
Yeah. Well, and we've talked about, too, kind of going back to the poor and how to educate the poor is sometimes when we do get corporations or we get large groups of parents pooling their money, they do create scholarship programs for the poorest of the poor, right?
Yeah, you bet. And that's what Tooley talks about in his book, that there'll be a school where people are paying $50 a month to send their child, and there'll be families that won't be able to afford the $50 a month, so other families pony up a nickel and that kid goes to school. And that is a great model. But there are a lot of corporations now that run private education within the company so that their employees can bring their kids with them to work. They have rooms decked out to be a school. They hire the teachers. They do whatever they have to do to provide an educational system that is not public school. And the parents very often have something to say about what happens in that school as members of that corporation, but also as parents of kids in that little school. I think that's a very interesting and promising model, as long as that education doesn't become revolved around the needs of that corporation, because that's dangerous. That's what's happened to public education.
Yeah. Well, and so we've talked about some of the negatives of public schooling, but the positives of homeschooling is that the education's bottom up, basically where parents and families have a choice, right?
That's right.
that the funding isn't controlled by one bureaucrat who makes all the decisions, and actually prices can be better in check. Would you agree with that?
I agree entirely, and I would take it further what you said. I know, for instance, the Texas School Board has issued over the last 5-6 years a lot of regulations and restrictions regarding textbooks, history textbooks. They decided, for instance, this is why you don't want a bureaucrat deciding for you what your kid learns. They decided that Thomas Jefferson is really not very important in history.
Oh, my goodness.
So they negated him from the book. Oh, no, it goes on and on. They made a list of people they politically disagree with, and they eliminated them from their textbooks. So, there's all kinds, Cesar Chavez, all kinds of people just disappeared from the textbooks. And that's disgusting. And you don't want your kid limited in terms of his education and experience by an administrator or a politician with an agenda, whether it's political or religious or whatever the agenda is. That should not determine what your child learns. If you really want to apply an agenda to his education, find out what the kid's agenda is and help him get there.
Yeah. Another positive thing that having a homeschooling community is you have kind of that one-room schoolhouse again, where you have kids that are maybe, younger, that are getting kind of a sneak preview of what they're going to be learning. You have other kids that are always constantly getting a review of things that they have learned, and it kind of keeps the cycle where the ages are mixed and all of that kind of
I talk about the Little Red Schoolhouse model all the time. I talk about the Little Red Schoolhouse model. I think it's great, but I think it's a little different than what you described in part. I think you're right about everything you said, but I would add a few things. If you place kids of various ages and abilities in one schoolroom, it's cheaper to run, obviously, because it only requires one teacher instead of 5 for the different age groups. One reason that schools have desks of different sizes, why we spend so much money on desks, and why desks are such a big deal in schools, that charities have been built around buying desks for third world schools. Desks, they're an industry. And originally, kids were placed into grade levels because it was cheaper to buy desks in bulk for kids of about the same size. So they would take all the 8-year-olds, place them in one room, and buy one unit size desk that would work for all. And that's why we have grade levels. It was all about money. But that has nothing to do, but it has nothing to do with education. Nothing. Now, imagine a scenario, and I talk about this in several of the books too, a club scenario. Let's start chess club. Let's say we have a chess club, and we allow all comers. So you have kids who are 8 years old, and you have kids who are 18 years old, and each one is as good at that thing, chess, as he's good at it. So now you have an 8-year-old whipping an 18-year-old, and the 18-year-old has to get his act together and play better and learn something about the game. It's a little more competitive. It's a little more challenging. But it also encourages each child there to ignore the age factor and concentrate on the skill factor, which is all that really matters. And what does it matter how old the kid is? You only care about what he knows and what can he do.
We talk about the rampant bullying that we see in school right now. I haven't seen that in mixed ages, which I think is interesting. You would think that if you get an older kid put with a younger kid, that would increase. But in fact, I think we see that there's more respect for people of all ages.
Yeah, I agree with you. When I've taught in a lot of schools, and I've taught in private schools a lot. And of course, in my homeschool group, we had kids who ranged in age from 7 to 17, literally every day, working together. And what I found was that the older kids became very protective of the younger kids.
Yeah.
And really, at some points, if the teacher got rough on a little kid as far as expecting too much, the older kids would step in and they'd say, hey, what are you pushing this kid hard for? They're just learning this subject. Leave the kid alone. The older student didn't just protect the kid ineffectively, but they were right. And, I would find out and I'd step in and say, no, the kid is right. Will you leave that young kid alone and let him work at his own pace? So I think they get very protective, especially if it's a homeschool group and that younger kid is your younger brother, right, or your younger sister. you're going to most likely protect them in that circumstance. I saw tons of that, and it was very interesting and rewarding. Families bond on that basis, by the way.
So a lot of the bullying that we have would probably go by the wayside.
Well, I never saw any bullying in a homeschool. I've never seen it. I haven't seen bullying.
And the other reason why is because the parents are so involved. They're right there. They see how little Johnny acts when he's with his peers. And if it isn't quality behavior, they make sure it gets rectified quickly.
That's right. And Mom and Dad, you're running your own school. You're responsible for your kids' education. Now Mom has skin in the game. Dad has skin in the game. They are directly involved. And there's no mystery to what's happening to your child because you're looking at it every day. You see it every day. If your child drops in tone, becomes depressed, unhappy, angry, you're right there to figure out what's going on. If your child is being, roughed up by somebody, I've, again, never seen it in a homeschool group, but if it were to happen, you're there every day. You don't have to wait for a report from the teacher or be called into the principal's office at a school to find out that your child is having a hard time. You know what's going on because you're directly participating on a daily basis. That's got to be good for the child. Has to be good for the child.
Well, and financially with the parents, like you said, they have skin in the game. When there are financial decisions that need to be made, they are going to obviously be a lot more. I mean, there's a lot of apathy if we look at, everyone feels like the way. We'll just increase the taxes. There's really no accountability. But in a homeschool setting like that, when their parents have some skin in the game, that financial apathy goes away.
Yes, it certainly does. I know a homeschool family of 5, and they go on very, very lengthy field trips every year. Like they'll go to London, they'll go to Paris. They'll do this once a year for 2 weeks, and the whole family goes. And that's a field trip for their quote-unquote school, and they save up for it all year long. They plan it all year long, and then they go and they do it. Those are parents who are not only directly involved, but are making financial decisions that benefit their child in the short and long term because they help provide their children experience and education. When you put your kid in a school, you have nothing to say about how that money gets spent. They may be spending $15,000 per child per year in a public school system, but you don't get to communicate to them how you want that money spent. And the reality is that the results are worse by far than in private education, and the situation is more dangerous. You would think, hey, you guys are spending $15,000 in 9 months to educate my kid, and you can't keep him safe from bullies? You're spending $15,000 on my kid, and he's bringing 3 hours of homework home every night in math and science and whatever because you can't get it done during the time he's in school, those 6 hours? Really, the results are pretty appalling. When it's your money, Mom, and it's your money, Dad, and you're going to spend it to educate your kid, you start looking very hard at results, and that's how it should be.
Yeah. Well, you just pointed out another plus for starting a homeschool or a community school is that there really isn't any homework unless the kid wants to go home and study some more about another topic. But you're not, stuck at the table doing this required amount of schoolwork with your child at a time that they don't want to be doing it anyway.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And
so another plus.
They already spent their 6 hours in school. Why are you asking them to do more? If you have a job and you're getting paid to do your job and you put in your 8 hours, you don't want to do more when you go home. You want to sit down with your family and do some things that you want to do. Why do we expect that our kids want less? That's inane. They're children. They need their freedom and their time. With homeschooling, homeschool groups, and also, folks, if you start a small private school, you do not need to assign homework. Either get the work done in school or reschedule how you're delivering curriculum so that the deadlines aren't quite so severe because you're not worried about state or federal tests. What do you care how long it takes a kid to learn a subject as long as he learns it? So if you do start a school, if you do start a homeschool group, let each child move at his own pace. And when the school hour is over, it's over. Let him go study stuff that he wants. Let him play baseball, let him get a sunburn, let him go swimming. We can't micromanage kids and expect them to ever grow up to be responsible adults.
They do need that off time. I mean, just like you were mentioning with an adult, even if an adult went home with extra work, I was always able to actually get extra pay for that too.
Yeah, and what is the reward the kid has?
None.
None and zero. This poor kid now gets to do 3 hours more math. But there is another problem with that concept, and that is that mom and dad get sucked into the homework. Hey, mom, your kid is failing math. He's going to have 3 hours of homework a night in math, and you better find a way to help him because we're going to fail him and hold him back a grade. Now, mom is also being punished because Junior's not caught up in math, caught up to some imaginary average student that doesn't exist. So, it's all garbage. Homework is garbage, and it's destructive of families, destructive of the child's freedom, destructive of his ability to pursue his own interests.
Another plus for homeschooling is that your relationships are better. You're not fighting,
Yeah. And we didn't have children. I didn't have 2 kids with my wife. My wife was considerably older than me and did not think she could have children. She passed away in 2001 of cancer. And when she died, my kids were 13 and 9 years old. When that happened, I had to seriously look at, what am I going to do about my children? That's just me now. And I knew at that point, and I knew before that, I didn't have children to turn them over to a school. They had gone to private schools their whole life up to that point, but I taught at those private schools almost every day. I ran arts departments and theater arts and music departments and taught. So I was right there watching their progress every day throughout their entire time in school. I got to tell you, I'm glad I did that because when my wife passed away, I already knew what I had to do to take care of my kids. We're already connected up in terms of their education, and there were no surprises or mysteries about what do I do next. So this is a very important formula, the homeschooling formula, or even the small private school. Get your family together, hold them tight to you, and make sure they get what they need so that when they go out in the world, they're really armed for it. They're ready for it. And by degree, dispense more and more responsibility to your kids and away from you. Give them progressively more responsibility for their education, for their lives, so that when they grow up, they're grown up.
What a fun conversation again. So. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us again.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm sure we'll find something else to talk about.
Yeah.
All right, Rebecca, thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. To learn more about Stephen Horwich, go to our show notes at theluminousmind.net. Also, be sure to become a subscriber to our free email list so you can receive notifications for our weekly audio blog, The Spark. We would love to have you join our program. Do so by going to the scheduling tab and become a fire starter today. Help support the podcast by making all your Amazon purchases through the free Amazon widget on our website, theluminousmind.net. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Google+. Get our audio content on YouTube, iTunes, and Stitcher. Leave us a review. Tell us how we can help you so together we can continue to light minds on fire and change the paradigm of education.